because of a biological understanding of the word, an embryo or a fetus is not obviously separate and cannot survive on its own from the pregnant woman, since it is inside her body and connected to her via the umbilical cord and placenta. Furthermore, the argument that these statements convey only the biological fact that the embryo or fetus is a member of the species Homo sapiens makes the statement utterly pointless. What else would it be? There is no competent person who thinks that a woman's embryo or fetus might be a member of some other species, and no one who knows what pregnancy is fails to know that, in the usual course, a pregnancy results in the birth of a human being, not a puppy dog. Those who would defend the statements in question as non-ideologically cannot provide a sensible reason why such a trivial fact ought to be disclosed to abortion patients. Generally, informed consent laws do not require healthcare professionals to make moral, philosophical statements. For example, end-of-life decisions implicate profound moral questions about the termination of human life, but doctors are not required to lecture patients about the moral considerations, much less to present the state's moral view as medical fact. Imagine a legislator dominated by Jehovah's Witnesses requiring doctors to tell patients who need blood transfusions that the procedure is prohibited by God. Objections to such a law would be fierce because even a religious majority should not intrude into the doctor-patient relationship and use doctors to present the majority's moral views to patients. Whether the proposition is philosophically or morally correct is not the issue. Making such statements is not a part of the physician's duty to convey the medical consideration relevant to a patient deciding whether to consent to a medical intervention. Patients are capable of seeking guidance regarding the moral dimensions of their decisions from the appropriate people, such as family members, clergy, or even healthcare professionals who provide abortions if they so desire. Women do not need a mandatory disclosure to inform them of the fact that the abortion decision is a morally weighty one. Women have an interest in choosing where to get their moral guidance from, as opposed to having the state's view thrust upon them with their physician as the mouthpiece. Several states require that women undergo ultrasounds, sometimes called sonograms, before obtaining abortions. In the context of abortion care, ultrasounds are primarily used to confirm that the pregnancy is in the uterus as opposed to being ectopic and the gestational age of the pregnancy. Ultrasounds intended to view a pregnancy may be performed vaginally by inserting a wand-shaped transducer into the vagina or abdominally by moving a broad transducer over the abdomen. Early in a pregnancy, a vaginal ultrasound provides a better view of the uterus and its contents. The majority of abortion providers routinely perform ultrasounds on their patients. Some states go further than requiring a pre-abortion ultrasound to be performed. North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Texas have enacted statutes that require women to have their ultrasound described to them, even if they do not want to hear such a description. The Oklahoma statute, which has been struck down, provided that in order for the woman to make an informed decision, an ultrasound must be performed at least 1 hour before the abortion, using either a vaginal transducer or an abdominal one, whichever would display the embryo or fetus more clearly. It requires the physician or technician to place the ultrasound in the woman's line of sight and to describe the image, including the dimensions of the embryo or fetus, the presence of cardiac activity if present and viewable, and the presence of external members and internal organs if present and viewable. Oklahoma State Senator Todd Lamb introduced a substantially identical prior version of this law in the state Senate. Lamb has acknowledged that the purpose of the ultrasound requirement was to reduce the number of abortions. He also stated that ultrasound allow doctors to disclose fully the information regarding the woman's pregnancy, and that requiring a woman to have an ultrasound would benefit her mental health, apparently by protecting her from later regretting the taking of a human life. Senator Lamb's comments fit with the way anti-abortion activists seem to view ultrasound requirements. They think that an ultrasound contributes to informed consent by conveying the moral status of the embryo or fetus to the woman, who will then decide to carry the pregnancy to term. Two assumptions in this line of thought should be made explicit. First, anti-abortion activists apparently think that some women fail to understand that abortion is wrong, but if that message is conveyed to them, they will not terminate their pregnancies. This disrespects the effort that women put into decisions about their pregnancy without the help of the state. There is also evidence that this assumption is false, since states with ultrasound requirements do not see a significant reduction in a number of abortions. In fact, I think there were more abortions before Roe versus Wade than there are today. There's certainly a lot less slut shaming. Second, anti-abortion activists seem to believe that it is acceptable to characterize the protocol as informed consent, when their primary reason for favoring it is that it will encourage patients to make the decision the activists approve of, that is, carry the pregnancy to term, rather than ensuring that patients exercise their own autonomy. Oklahoma statute required a vaginal ultrasound in some cases because there will be circumstances in which a vaginal ultrasound provides a clearer image than an abdominal one. Thus, the law required women to submit to a vaginal penetration without consent. This is a violation of bodily integrity and brings up the disturbing connotations of rape. In 2011, Texas followed Oklahoma and amended its basic counseling statute to require that an ultrasound be performed at least 24 hours before any abortion. The provider is also required to display the sonograph image in a manner that the pregnant woman may view then. Explain the ultrasound image, make the embryonic or fetal heartbeat audible, and provide a verbal explanation of the sign. The North Carolina legislature enacted a similar law over Governor Beverly Perdue's veto in 2011. The laws in all three of these states apparently require that patients listen to a description of the ultrasound or the heartbeat even if they don't want to. This takes the choice of what information the patient will receive away from the physician and the patient.
May I inquire of my fellow Missourian?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. So, my name is Alex Townsend. I live in Columbia, Missouri. I'm originally from Texas. I'm here today because I believe that women should have control over their bodies, and decisions about their health care should be made between them, their family, and their physician. And I was so inspired to see them start this filibuster earlier this week on Monday at 2 p.m. And it's going to be ending later this afternoon at 2 p.m. after a full 72 hours, which is just incredible. I'm originally from Texas, so I'm going to read a little bit here from the indomitable Molly Ivins, and it's her column from the paper when she was writing in Texas called "Legal Answers Won't Resolve Abortion Fight." Far away from the screaming demonstrators and screaming counter-demonstrators so hopelessly divided over a woman's right to choose to have an abortion, away from the television cameras and the posturing, away from the pushing and shoving and harassed cops, in the solemn quiet hush of the Supreme Court, the only action that really counts on abortion took place last week. Those who witnessed it said the atmosphere was curiously deflated. They felt none of the tension and suppressed excitement that normally accompanies major arguments before the court. The Pennsylvania case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, turns on 5 restrictions on women who choose to have abortions, one of them patently silly, one potentially devastating for a few minors, and the others apparently reasonable, or at least, as the law puts it, not unduly burdensome on the surface. On reading the transcript of that argument, I felt, and Sarah Weddington, this Texas lawyer who argued Roe v. Wade in 1972 and who was in the court last week, confirms that perhaps the critical moments occurred when 2 judges asked essentially the same question. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor asked a woman lawyer for the American Civil Liberties Union, and Justice Harry Blackmun asked the male Attorney General of Pennsylvania, in Blackmun's words, "Have you read Roe?" It is a bit like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon to try making this point again and again in the face of so many people who are convinced otherwise. But Roe v. Wade did not give women the right to abortion on demand. Roe sets up a trimester framework in which the state's interest in protecting fetal life increases as the fetus becomes viable, able to live outside the womb. Only the mother's life or health takes precedence over the fetal life in the 3rd trimester. The 2 most troubling restrictions in the Pennsylvania law are requirements that a married woman inform her husband and that minor women get the consent of their parents before they can have abortions. You could sort of see the justices goggling at the first requirement. O'Connor wanted to know if there were First Amendment implications in compelling speech. She also asked about the First Amendment implications of compelling doctors, as the Pennsylvania law does, to describe a great long list of fetal development options and the social services. The best information available indicates that 95% of married women seeking abortions do inform their husbands, as the vast majority of teenagers also inform at least one parent. If they have one, they can find. The problem is with the exceptions and the sometimes tragic consequences of state-ordered communication. A woman legislator in Pennsylvania The notify your husband provision was being debated, proposed a law that would require husbands to notify their wives before having an affair. Her point, of course, was the absurdity of the law requiring communication in a family where communication is broken down. The Pennsylvania law is silly in that it validates its own requirements. The exceptions to the husband notification requirement are medical emergency, when the husband is not the father of the child. I'm going to have an abortion, dear, but don't worry, it's not your child. When the husband cannot be found, when the pregnancy is the result of reported sexual assault, or when the woman believes it is likely she will be physically abused. Somehow, all this, according to the Pennsylvania Attorney General, will, quote, further the integrity of marriages. O'Connor was clearly intrigued by this odd discrimination involved. Unmarried women in Pennsylvania are not required to notify the fathers. If you have ever talked with minor girls who apply for the court's consent to get an abortion rather than notify their parents, you understand something of the wretched tangle of violence, incest, and physical abuse that afflicts so many families. When legislators go about putting restrictions on abortion, as though every family consisted of Ozzie and Harriet and 2 darling children, they add another terrible burden to the lives that are already almost unbearable. You cannot save the life of an unborn child by driving its mother to suicide. A particularly thoughtful letter to the editor last week noted that those on both sides of this issue who harass others and the law do not have a commitment to the movement beyond meanness, and revenge against uppity women and or super righteous Christians. The feminists claim that many who profess to care for the unborn children are actually more interested in controlling the behavior of women is sometimes evident in the most comical ways. The Wall Street Journal carried an account of the Battle of Buffalo last week that included a vignette of a 69-year-old man shouting at a pro-choice woman, "You have a choice. Stop screwing around." Oh dear. Well, there are still a few people who think that's what's at stake. But far from the maddening crowd, where the majesty of the law comes into play, the issues, oddly, seem more nakedly clear. The only question is, who is to decide? The government or the individual? A government that has the power to make a woman bear a child she does not want also has the power to make her abort a child she does want. The two apparent polar opposites here, actually flip sides of the same coin, are China and Romania. In China, the government forces women to have abortions. In Romania, until recently, the government forced women to have one child after another with awful results. In both countries, there was state control over women's homes. I would love to be able to split the difference on this terrible question, to be able to say in gooey Pollyanna fashion, let's all work together to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Settling the legal questions on this issue will not settle the moral ones, but I cannot believe it is wise to give government the power to make these decisions. What's incredible is as I was listening to the debate last night, and I was listening to primarily a bunch of men debate whether or not the government should regulate a woman's room, I was just struck by the fact that several legislators were saying that they could speak for women, and I'll be quite honest, there's no man who can speak for me about my own healthcare decisions that I make between myself, my family, my partner, my doctor, and whatever spiritual entity I so believe in. So it's really interesting that we have folks in government who are trying to regulate my room. So with that,
May I inquire with my fellow Missourians?
I yield to my fellow sir.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Angela Pryor, and I'm from Missouri, and I'm participating in the Filibuster, which began on May 12th at 2 p.m. It's being held for the next 72 hours. It will conclude today at 2 p.m. I'm here to represent women in their rights, their reproductive rights. I volunteer as a court advocate for many years against domestic violence, and I've seen many, many situations that are really unthinkable, that people don't understand what goes on in households in our country today, and that our reproductive rights have to be protected. And with that, I'm going to read from the Filibuster binder. Part 3 is a survey of some of the most influential and well-developed accounts of informed consent in medical ethics. None of these accounts provides an ethical justification for the features of biased counseling laws discussed above. This part analyzes a number of different approaches to informed consent. I chose these views to focus on either because they are highly influential in the field of medical ethics or because they are well-developed accounts and exhibit significant philosophical differences from the highly influential accounts, providing a diversity of approaches to examine. For present purposes, I am agnostic as to which, if any, of these accounts of informed consent is correct. My purpose is to survey well-developed views of the concept in the field of medical ethics and to argue that biased counseling law failed to serve the purposes of ethical concept on any of these different views. Okay, perhaps the most influential account of informed consent is the field of medical ethics and a theory presented by Ruth Faden and Tom Beauchamp in A History and Theory of Informed Consent. Faden and Beauchamp offer a conceptual analysis of informed consent, explaining the logical and philosophical contours of concept. Informed consent, in the sense I am concerned with, is the autonomous authorization by the patient for a medical professional to undertake an intervention. Faden and Beauchamp developed their account of moral philosophy from the framework in which principles are fundamental. Rights, duties, obligations, as well as professional codes and legal regulations are derived from or evaluated with reference on principles. These principles are relevant to informed consent, respect for autonomy, beneficence, and justice. Although these principles are of equal weight and none necessarily trumps the others as general matter. When it comes to informed consent, respect for autonomy is the single most important moral value. These three principles approach, also called pluralistic principalism, is the dominant philosophical framework in the medical ethics field. The principle of respect for autonomy requires that individuals be free to choose and act without controlling constraints imposed by others. It is the recognition of this principle that has led to the acceptance of a requirement for informed consent in clinical medicine. Beneficence is the promotion of welfare of others. Is clearly fundamental in the practice of medicine, which is at the heart the attempt to make patients better. In the informed consent context, the principle of beneficence can easily come into conflict with the principle of autonomy. A physician may want to undertake a medical intervention because it is what is best for the patient, regardless of whether the patient consents to the intervention or whether the patient has the information necessary to make her own decision. This is the problem with paternalism and the question of how to balance the competing values of pursuing patient welfare and protecting patient autonomy pervades discussions of informed consent. The third principle, justice, requires that individuals be treated according to what is fair, due, or owed. This principle has implications regarding the allocation of scarce medical resources. Although Faden and Beauchamp also note that it is unjust to impose an undue burden on the ability to exercise authority, for example, by making a piece of information owed to a person unreasonably difficult to obtain. Since their account of informed consent emphasizes the principle of respect for autonomy, Faden and Beauchamp offer a conceptual analysis of autonomous action. An action of is autonomous only if it satisfies the conditions intentionally understanding and non-control. Because the latter two conditions admit of degrees rather than being all or nothing, actions may be more or less autonomous on this account. The action of intentional, if it is willed in accordance with a plan, the second condition, understanding, is a matter of degree, in that individuals can have more or less understanding. An individual acts with the complete understanding if she has the adequate apprehension of all the relevant descriptions of both the nature and the action and the foreseeable consequences of taking and not taking the action. The substantial understanding necessary for informed consent requires that the patient understand all the material or important propositions that add to her comprehension of her situation. False beliefs are detrimental to understanding. When an individual takes an action while believing a false proposition relevant to that action, the action is less than fully autonomous. Whether a proposition is material or determined whether it subjectively matters to a patient's evaluation of options. Third, the condition of non-control means the actions are less than fully autonomous to the extent that they are controlled by external factors, especially other people. For Faden and Beauchamp, some external influences do not prevent actions from being autonomous. Those that the individual can resist, those that do not cause the individual to fail the condition of substantial understanding, and those that appeal to the reason that the individual freely accepts. The first three conditions, but refuses the intervention, gives an informed refusal. Faden and Beauchamp reject the notion that professionals should attempt to instill the substantial understanding necessary for informed consent through a standard set of disclosures. Rather than check off a list of disclosures, professionals should focus on effective communication, which requires an informational exchange. Physicians must ask questions and learn what is important to the patient and must elicit questions from the patients themselves. However, a core disclosure is still necessary to initiate the communication process. It should be guided by three considerations. One, propositions that patients usually think are material regarding the proposed intervention. Two, what the professional thinks is material, including the recommendation regarding treatment. And three, an explanation about the purpose of seeking consent and the nature of the authorization. These disclosures lead to a dialogue intended to bring about a shared understanding between patient and professional. This account does not require that the patient and professional believe all the same propositions. It is enough that they each understand the material propositions and the other beliefs without necessarily accepting them as true, as long as the beliefs in question are inherently consensual. If, on the other hand, a patient has an unjustifiable false belief about a material proposition, then a shared understanding has not been achieved and informed consent is not possible. For example, a patient's refusal to consent to cancer treatment because of an unjustifiable belief that she could not have cancer because she did not feel sick would not be an informed refusal because the patient holds an unjustified material false belief. Regarding inherently consentable material propositions, Faden and Beauchamp's account requires the professional to communicate with her and communicate her view and the patient to understand that the professional believes the proposition, although it does not require that the patient believe the proposition herself. One phenomenon that can cause a problem for a patient understanding is the framing effect. A person's choice can be affected by the way the options are described. For example, people are more likely to choose an option presented as a 75% chance of survival than an option presented as a 25% chance of death, even though the risk is exactly the same. Faden and Beauchamp note that the framing effect can be used to manipulate patient choice, and they can recognize that framing may endanger substantial understanding. They recommend that professionals attempt to avoid the effect by presenting both sides of the story, the positive frame as well as the negative frame. Generally, the manipulation of the information, the modification of a person's perceptions of the options available to her, is incompatible with the informed consent, where it causes the person to fail to have substantial understanding. Faden and Beauchamp contend that manipulation of information is unlikely to be compatible with informed consent and recommend against this practice. Other forms of manipulation do not necessarily act through an effect of the understanding. In contrast to the phenomena discussed immediately above, Faden and Beauchamp call this category psychological manipulation, and it includes such strategies as appeals to emotional weakness and the inducing of guilt or feeling of obligation. If an instance of psychological manipulation is not easily restrictable by the target, then it is incompatible with the condition of substantial non-control required for autonomous action. As with informational manipulation, Fade and Beauchamp advise professionals completely avoid using psychological manipulation. With this summary of Fade and Beauchamp's analysis of informed consent in hand, this article will now evaluate the degree of which biased counseling laws ensure the patient consent to abortion is probably informed. Biased counseling laws obstacles to informed consent. Fade and Beauchamp see the process of informing a patient as one that should strive toward effective communication between professional and patient. The professional makes disclosures based on what she finds important and what she predicts that the patient will find important. And the patient communicates what she finds important. A list of statements inserted into the professional-patient dialogue by a legislature does not fit with the model. This fact shows why irrelevant and immaterial statements or disclosures such as descriptions or pictures of embryos or fetuses or later gestational stages than the patient's pregnancy should not be required by informed consent laws, nor should ideological or moral statements which may not conform to the professional's beliefs and may be unwelcome to the patient. A patient who subjectively finds such statements relevant should, of course, mention that in discussions with healthcare professionals treating her and receive the information. The physician has an obligation to answer the questions, but she should not be legally mandated to provide information to a patient that does not find the material or want to hear it. Furthermore, some features of biased counseling laws actively sustain patient's autonomy and informed consent, as I explained below. Deception. According to Fade and Beauchamp's account, deception is a form of manipulation of information that uses such intentional strategies as lying, withholding of information, true assertion that omits a vital qualification, and misleading exaggeration in order to cause persons to believe what is false. While not every instance of deception of a patient is incompatible with informed consent, these techniques are likely to inhibit substantial understanding and therefore threaten the degree in which the patient's consent is autonomous. As shown above, many statements that biased counseling laws require professionals to make or present to patients are deceptive, inasmuch as statements cause patients to have false beliefs that are material to their decisions. They decrease patient understanding and thereby decrease patient autonomy. Deceptive statements that are required by law purported to guarantee informed consent to abortion therefore make informed consent less likely and are in direct opposition to the law's declared purpose. For example, imagine that a Michigan woman with no history of mental illness or trauma becomes pregnant and believes that having a baby does not fit in with her life plan at the time. She arranges to have an abortion and is given counseling materials as required by law. In those materials, she reads that an abortion may cause her to experience depression, feelings of guilt, sleep disturbance, loss of interest in work or sex, or anger. As a result, she forms a false belief that terminating her pregnancy will significantly increase the likelihood that she experience these negative effects. She considers the risk of depression, sleep disturbance, and other effects to be material to her decision regarding whether to have an abortion. After weighing her belief about the risks together with all of the factors, she changes her mind and decides to carry her pregnancy to term. This decision is not substantially autonomous because the woman fails the condition of substantial understanding. She has a false belief about a proposition that is material to her decision. Because Michigan's biased counseling law caused her to form a false belief, she refused to have to Fade and Beauchamp's model. Her decision failed to qualify as an informed refusal. For this woman, the law was an obstacle to autonomy and therefore to informed consent. The same analysis applies to all of the deceptive statements that biased counseling laws require be made or offered to patients, such as abortion increases the risk of breast cancer or fertility problems. In addition to falsehoods like those mandated in Michigan, some biased counseling laws use true statements that are calculated to mislead. For example, states statements about fetal pain in biased counseling laws are carefully crafted to present information that is strictly speaking true but misleading because it does not include key qualifications, including the fact that there is medical controversy over the ability of the fetuses to feel pain in various stages of gestation. As Faden and Bauchamp recognize, the manipulation of information is a threat to informed consent when it prevents patients from achieving substantial understanding. To tell the patient that at 20 weeks a fetus has the anatomical structures necessary to feel pain, which is contested, without going on to explain the reasons to doubt that the fetus actually does feel pain, is to mislead the patient. That is to make her think the scientific evidence clearly favors the conclusion that the fetus can feel pain. If the patient thinks that the fetal pain is relevant to her decision regarding whether to terminate her pregnancy, then the disclosure of the is detrimental to her understanding of the material fact, and such makes her decision less likely to be substantially autonomous action. Other informational manipulation, biased counseling materials also attempt to make use of framing effective and to discourage abortions. The Texas materials discuss the negative risks of abortion procedures at length. The booklet notes the risk of death for abortion at various gestational stages, rather than presenting the information in terms of chances of survival. Lists of other risks are given for each type of abortion procedure with no information about the likelihood of occurrence for each listed risk. The only discussion of the positive effects of abortion is a brief mention that some women, quote, may feel relief that the procedure is over, unquote. The risks of childbirth are also mentioned after the statement. Pregnancy and birth is usually a safe, natural process, although complications can occur. Abortion is also usually a safe procedure, but the booklet does not make that statement because its wording and organization are designed to discourage abortions. This use of framing may lead to some patients to false beliefs about the relative risks of abortions and childbirth, which could prevent them from achieving a substantial understanding necessary to make an autonomous choice regarding pregnancy and termination. Biased counseling materials usually include information about all the types of abortion procedures, including procedures that are not only used for later term pregnancies, and which are therefore irrelevant to the vast majority of abortion patients. It is possible that the inclusion of this information, such as descriptions of dilation and extraction, could confuse a patient and make her think that the procedure she will undergo will be more involved and more risky than it actually will be. This confusion would threaten her ability to arrive at a substantial understanding. Psychological manipulation. Psychological manipulation differs from deception and the other forms of informational manipulation discussed above, in that it does not necessarily threaten a substantial understanding necessary for autonomous action. Faden and Beauchamp advise against its use in the informed consent process because of the risk that the patient will not be able to resist the influence. If a professional psychological manipulation is irresistible for a patient, her decision will be controlled by the professional and therefore will not be autonomous. Empirical research shows that appeals to fear can be highly likely to elicit the recommended course of action due to the power of negative emotional response, as opposed to the persuasion through reasons. This effect may be intensified when the source of the message is perceived as having a high degree of credibility, such as the healthcare professional or the government. Some statements about risk in counseling materials seem to be intended to elicit fear rather than provide information for weighing risks. For example, the West Virginia booklet characterizes abortion as a traumatic experience and warns women that they may develop PTSD. This statement does not present objective information that can be used to weigh the risk of various options. It just makes abortion seem frightening. Pictures of embryos and fetuses at various stages in development do not convey any information about risks or treatment or alternatives. Anti-abortion forces believe that they convey emotional content that personifies the embryo or fetus. Ultrasound laws in North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Texas are designed to force patients to listen to descriptions of the embryo or fetus, presumably assuming that this will generate an emotional reaction that will make it harder for patients to go through with the abortions. Similarly, fetal pain disclosures are framed to make it seem more likely that the fetus will feel pain than is true for the precise reason that the authors seem to increase feelings of guilt, either to punish the patient or discourage her from obtaining an abortion. These pictures and statements may stimulate an emotional reaction, such as guilt. If the emotional reaction were actually impossible for the patient to resist, as she attempts to decide, it would cause her to fail the condition of non-control necessary for autonomous action. This is because the individual who acts in accord with an emotion that is irresistible does not make a choice at all, unlike being rationally persuaded of prudential or moral considerations. An irresistible emotion unavoidably compels an action to prevent the exercise of autonomy. Removal of patient control over procedures and their timing. Some features of biased counseling laws can remove the patient's ability to control the course of medical interventions. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
May I yield? Will you yield? Can I yield to my fellow Missouri? May I inquire?
Yes, I will yield.
Thank you, sister. My name is Bradley Harmon. I am president of Local 6355 of the Communications Workers of America. Local 6355 of CWA represents 6,000 social service employees working for the state of Missouri. Every day, members of CWA Local 6355 assist Missouri's low-income women who are struggling to access basic health care that they need. I'm proud to stand with Missouri's women and concerned men today who are outraged and appalled at the legislative attacks on women's health care that our elected representatives in the state of Missouri and in our capital right here are undertaking during this legislative session. It is galling to me that individuals who claim to be pro-life are right now ignoring a chance to provide health care to 300,000 low-income Missourians by expanding access to the Medicaid program, and are instead focusing on taking away women's choices and refusing to trust women in how they access their health care. The CWA was proud to stand with women's health advocates in 2012 as across the state of Missouri, we stood up to attacks on women's choices when Todd Akin was running for the U.S. Senate. And I'm proud to stand with women today to speak out against the unreasonable and unconscionable attacks on women's choices and women's ability to access health care during the people's filibuster that's going on right now in Jefferson City. I think it's really important to think about a few things here. What's happening in our capital as it relates to women's healthcare choices and women's choices generally. The Missouri State Legislature spent a great deal of time debating a measure called paycheck deception during this legislative session. The paycheck deception measure that the Missouri Legislature was considering and spent a huge amount of floor time working on attacked women workers and assumed that women workers don't know what they're doing when they decide to join a union to be able to take a voice in the political process and have a voice at work. And those same legislators are attacking women and undermining women's ability to make choices about their own health care by trying to regulate access to vital health care services. It's the same attack over and over again. In CWA, we believe that there are fundamental problems with our democratic system. And we believe that in order to turn those around, labor must partner with women, with civil rights organizations, with environmental groups to create a grassroots democracy movement that will take our country back to the kind of system that we were all taught in civics class that we actually had. And this attack on women's health care that's going on in the state legislature right now is a symptom of the same problem. It's a block on our democracy. And it's something that should concern everyone, regardless of our sex, regardless of whether or not we're going to need abortion services or any other kind of reproductive health care services. The same individuals who are pushing these unnecessary restrictions on women's ability to access health care have also been the same people who've been trying to make it possible for someone's boss to decide whether or not they should be able to access contraceptive care. The same people who are attacking women's ability to access health care are trying to pass restrictive photo ID legislation that would disenfranchise thousands of Missouri women and keep them from voting. It's really sad that at this time, when there are so many people in Missouri who are out of work, when there are so many people who lack access to basic health care, when there are so many Missouri people who don't have access to schools that are able to support them, that instead of dealing with those real problems, our legislature is choosing to push divisive issues that are only intended to drive a wedge between working families and are a dodge at addressing the real problems that Missouri's families face. As a member of organized labor, I think that it is appalling that this is what our legislature is choosing to focus on. Instead of focusing on the real problems that Missouri has, a huge number of children in the state of Missouri don't have access to basic food. A huge number of children in the state of Missouri don't have access to basic health care. Our foster care system in the state of Missouri is one of the most poorly funded in the entire country. Just last week, whenever we were debating our budget, I come out of the children's division in the state of Missouri, in the Department of Social Services. We work with kids who are at risk of abuse or neglect. And the same people who claim to be pro-life and who are pushing legislation that would restrict women's health care choices have been cutting support for low-income Missouri families year after year after year. And I have to ask myself, if these people really care about Missouri's children, why don't they care about them after they're born? Why don't they? And that's what is happening in our state legislature right now. There's a real push to divide this democracy movement, and the reason why there's that push is that when the forces of division can separate working people from other working people, when they can separate one group of women from another group of women, the forces of the 1%, the forces of wealth and power that are really trying to take over our democratic system have a lot easier time. And it's important for all of us to understand that when these divisive attacks happen, we can't fall prey. We can't let ourselves be divided, because when we're divided, we're going to be conquered. And my rights at work as a man are tied to my sister's rights to get the health care that she needs when she goes to the doctor's office, whatever kind of health care that is. Members of my union have a lot of different opinions on a lot of different issues, but one thing that the members of my union understand is that working women in the state of Missouri are not getting a fair shake. Working women in the state of Missouri aren't getting paid equally. Working women in the state of Missouri are having their rights to organize attacked. Working women in the state of Missouri often lack access to basic health care services. And instead of dealing with these very real and solvable problems, our leaders in the legislature in the state of Missouri are choosing instead to question the ability of women to make choices about controlling their own bodies. And they're not doing that because they care about women. And if you look at their record of voting to support children in this state, it's pretty obvious that they're not doing that because they care about children. They're doing that for control, and they're doing that to divide and weaken us, to entrench the forces of wealth and power that are corrupting our democratic system. And it's time to stop. It's time for all of us who care about living in a democratic country to stand together and to say that we will not tolerate attacks on our basic rights as human beings. And the right to access health care is as basic a right as we can get. And abortion is health care. It's health care. The ability to decide whether or not it's appropriate to carry a pregnancy or not is a choice that should be between a woman and her doctor. And it's not a choice that a politician should interfere with. It's even more galling that some of the services that are being attacked by this bill are some of the services that are some of the only healthcare services that many low-income women are able to get. It's time to stop. It's time for us to stand together and time for us to take our democracy back. Doing that means standing up to attacks on women's health care, women's rights to organize, and women's rights to choose. And I'm happy to be here today to do that.
May I inquire of my fellow Missourians?
I'm happy to yield to my fellow Missourians.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Vivian Wheeler. I'm from Springfield, Missouri, and I will be reading from the Michigan Journal of Gender and Law today. Removal of patient control over procedures and their timing. Some features of bias counseling laws remove the patient's ability to control the course of medical interventions. Many bias consent laws require patients to wait a fixed amount of time after receiving counseling or an ultrasound. Baden and Beauchamp recognize that placing a time pressure on patients' decisions is not conducive to informed consent. Patients have made a behavioral commitment by going to the provider and may be resistant to information that challenges the original decision, or they may need time to make a decision. However, nothing in Baden and Beauchamp's account provides support for mandatory waiting periods of fixed length. Not every patient in a given state needs 24 hours. Rather, healthcare professionals should be sensitive to the possibility that a given patient will benefit from having more time to decide after the informed consent dialogue has taken place and tailor the scheduling of the medical intervention accordingly. Failure of bias counseling laws to promote well-being. Baden and Beauchamp allow that the need to balance competing moral principles make it possible to have a morally acceptable set of requirements for legally effective informed consent that differs from the views that informed consent is an autonomous authorization. In this section, I examine the possibility that the principle of beneficence may justify the features of bias counseling laws that threaten patient autonomy. The principle of beneficence requires physicians to avoid, prevent, and remove harm while also promoting well-being. Beneficence would prima facie justify, for example, a doctor withholding information about a treatment alternative that she knows is markedly less effective than her recommended treatment in order to prevent the patient from choosing a course of action that is not the most conducive to the patient's well-being. This example shows the potential between beneficence and the principle of respect for autonomy. The patient who is not informed of the available alternative when she would consider this information material does not make an autonomous choice to pursue the physician's recommended treatment. While many would maintain that respect for autonomy should overcome the prima facie force of beneficence in such circumstances, a paternalistic view of medicine would allow the infringement on autonomy in order to benefit the patient's health. Since bias counseling laws are often criticized for being paternalistic, it might seem that they can be justified by a model of informed consent that emphasizes beneficence rather than autonomy. It is an ethical position that sees paternalism as positive because it helps patients do what is in their best interest, even when they do not will it. Might provide an ethical grounding for bias counseling laws. There are two ways that beneficence might justify features of bias counseling laws that threaten patient autonomy. First, they might discourage abortions, which would contribute to patient well-being if abortion is always, or at least usually, detrimental to well-being. Second, they might allow patients who terminate their pregnancies to have better outcomes by preparing them for the experience of having an abortion and the consequences. However, as I will show, neither justification warrants a paternalistic application of the principle of beneficence as overruling the principle of respect for autonomy. Turning to the first justification. there is little or no evidence that biased counseling laws actually discourage significant numbers of women from deciding to terminate their pregnancy. Waiting periods create a logistical obstacle that can significantly delay abortions and may prevent some women from getting abortions altogether. But I distinguish that from discouraging women from deciding in favor of terminating their pregnancies. Just as locking someone in a room may stop them from taking an action without changing their mind or stopping them from willing that action. But even assuming that these laws make women less likely to choose abortion, they cannot be justified by the principle of beneficence because it is not the case that induced abortion is more detrimental to women than childbirth or miscarriage. By inventing and publicizing the idea of post-abortion syndrome, a supposedly common negative psychological reaction to abortion, the anti-abortion movement would argue that abortion is harmful to women, but abortion is an extremely safe procedure. The empirical evidence debunking anti-abortion activists' myths about the harms of abortion is discussed above. Furthermore, the alternative of childbirth is not without its risks and burdens. As for the second argument that biased counseling can provide improved patient outcomes for abortion, there is little or no evidence supporting this proposition. It is generally true that informed consent disclosures can help patients by letting them know what to expect, encouraging treatment compliance, and so on. Certainly, patients should be informed about what the procedure will entail.
Hi, may I inquire for fellow Missourians?
And yield to my fellow Missourians.
Hello, my name is Lauren Dow. I am a communication student at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. I am participating in the 72-hour filibuster, which started at 2 p.m. on Monday, May 12th, and will end today, Thursday, May 15th at 2 p.m. I am here today because I am from the Boot Heel. I'm originally from Sikeston, Missouri, which is in one of the poorest regions in the entire country. And the women from my hometown are exactly the women that this 72-hour delay was designed to harm. And women in Missouri are tired. We're tired of our elected officials that believe that they know what's best for us. I've met a senator that's told me that he supports this bill because women need time to think about their decision to have an abortion, as if we're mindlessly or accidentally traveling to St. Louis and spending hundreds of dollars on this procedure, taking time out of our lives, having to find places to put our children. It's as if we've never, prior to that very test or prior to that very moment, or prior to our informed consent, thought about what we would do if we became pregnant. This is not true. I think that most women, regardless of their thoughts on abortion, have thought about what they would do if they become pregnant. To not consider this possibility is a privilege that women don't have. We're tired of our elected officials avoiding us. It has taken excessive effort for me to get through to some of my legislators who were hired to represent me to make my opinions known about this and other egregious bills. It's apparent that Missouri legislators have not spent 72 hours becoming educated on the impact of their actions on the women in this state. Many of these legislators represent districts that are very poor, yet they do not consider the needs of the lower income women that they are supposed to represent. Women are tired of fighting to keep a necessary right that was granted to them over 40 years ago by the Supreme Court. We're tired of Missouri legislators that think they know more about the law than the highest court in the land. We are tired of these false conservatives that don't want government intrusion in their own lives, but want to intrude on the lives of poor pregnant women every chance that they get. Control over family size and timing is necessary for women to control their destinies. Rich women will have this control no matter what, even if the situation becomes dire enough that they will need to leave their state or even their country to do it. The poor women in Missouri that are being failed by their legislators will have nowhere to turn but to potentially harmful choices, whether that be an illegal and unsafe abortion or a later-term abortion forced by this waiting period. Legislators in the Missouri Assembly have refused to believe this. I wish them the best in their fantasies. The truth is that this bill is truly impactful in real Missouri lives. Abortion is not the abstract idea that it becomes in our political debate. It is empowering many Missouri women to move forward with their lives and successfully follow their ambitions. I would like to share some of their stories with you. These are all women that I know, although I have changed their names for the purposes of this speech. My friend Suzanne was engaged when she found out that she was pregnant. While her parents would have been disappointed that she didn't wait until she was married to have a child, she believed that everything would be okay because she and her soon-to-be husband were devoted to each other and becoming prepared to go through anything together. She did not believe that her fiancé would have left her when he found out, but that was what happened. She now had to face a pregnancy alone and had to face telling her parents that she was not only pregnant but now single. Her choice to have an abortion was made and followed through without support because she was afraid to tell anyone. Suzanne did not have the money or the stability to have a healthy pregnancy, let alone a child, and could not count on support from her parents, who made it clear that a child out of wedlock was not welcome in their family. She was devastated to be in that position, but made a decision that was right as she could. Sooner was safer for her and emotionally easier to handle. This is true for many women. Suzanne's choice gave her the opportunity to be a man that truly loved her, and their marriage of nearly 25 years has produced a beautiful family of honor students and successful graduates. Her choice empowered her to make the home that she wanted at the time that she was ready for it. Maria's story is similar. As a single mother with a toddler, she found herself in an unplanned pregnancy while struggling to support her existing son on a low-wage full-time job. The man that would have been the father did not have any job, and she could not count on him for any kind of emotional support. She also chose to have an abortion alone. She was afraid to tell her parents. She was afraid that they would talk her out of her choice, or that they would refuse to support her or her son anymore if they found out that she had planned to make that choice. She made the drive to St. Louis alone from the boot heel, had her abortion alone, had her recovery alone, and drove home alone. Because she had to drive alone, she was not able to accept any pain medication for her procedure. When she went home, back to the boot heel, she got to return with her son, and later got to meet, yet again, a man that loved her, that she is now married to, and have another beautiful child. She is now back in school and hopes to someday be here. The next two stories are stories of women who have turned to me personally for support while making the choice to have an abortion. The first is my friend Sarah, who lived with me while she found out that she was pregnant. She was with me because she had been kicked out from her parents' house already and had nowhere else to go, and I let her sleep on my couch for free. Sarah had just come to Springfield from Clayton and did not have anywhere else to go, did not have any financial support from her parents, and did not have a job. When she found out that she was pregnant, she was able to receive her informed consent in Springfield, but still had to wait over a week to go to St. Louis to have her abortion because she did not have time to travel the next day after her 24-hour waiting period was over. This will be true for many Missouri women if the 72-hour bill is allowed by Governor Kemp to pass. Except that those women will have to travel to St. Louis to be able to get their informed consent. Will have to either wait there or have to come back later whenever they have the money. Those women may have to wait longer than a week. Those women may have to wait for several weeks or a month or 2 months before they can come up with funds. Because if they find themselves in a situation like Sarah's, they will not have a steady source of income or a sufficient source of income to support their choice. The last story that I would like to tell you is the story of my friend Lauren. Lauren was living in Kansas City at the time, and she had just made the choice to change schools from an art school in Kansas City to UMKC because she decided to switch her major. The partner that she became pregnant with did not have a job, and the job that she had was also low wage, part-time, and a pregnant woman quit school, work full-time, and quit the side modeling career that she had just started. She chose to have an abortion despite her own personal beliefs that abortion was wrong because it was the right choice for her at the time. And it was a choice that, despite her previous opposition to abortion, she was able to make. All of these women are real women. They are all women that I personally know. And they are all women that have been empowered to make a choice in the state of Missouri. And they are all women that would have potentially had to make an unsafe choice if they had been forced to wait longer between making their choice and receiving their procedure. Thank you for the time that I've been able to share those stories with you. I would now like to share some other stories from the 1 in 3 campaign to collect stories from across the country. I was 27 when I had my abortion. I was in a very controlling and abusive relationship with a man who was 20 years younger than me. It was a very bad situation. When I took the pregnancy test and realized that yes, I told him about it. He was angry and verbally abusive, and just when he started to calm down, he said, "Just what I need, another kid." I didn't know until that point that he had other children. We had been dating for over a year. He never saw the kids that he had. In fact, he was living off of me and my money. I was paying his rent, paying for his food, paying for the gas in his car, etc. He was working part-time and getting paid under the table. It was at that point that I realized he was doing that in order to avoid paying child support for the kids he already had. Not the kind of situation I thought I would ever be in. I thought everything over, discussed it with my mom, and decided that I could not bring a life into a situation like that. Could I have taken care of a baby? Probably, but I also didn't want to have a child with someone who never appeared to know or cared about his own child, much less someone who was manipulative and controlling. I told him what I decided to do, and he said he'd go with me. I went to the clinic after the 3-day waiting period, and on my way in and out was shouted at by protesters. I made my decision and I wasn't turning back no matter what they said. I recall being in the room, the nurse offered to hold my hand, but I refused. There was a poster of puppies on the ceiling. Then I lay in recovery for a bit and was on my way. We left and I started to drive away, at which point he said, "Could you drop me off at a friend's house so I can borrow his motorcycle?" I told him, "No way. I just went through one of the most difficult days of my life and you want me to run you around?" I missed the next several days of work as I was an emotional wreck after. He and I went our separate ways shortly after I had the abortion. He stalked me for a long while after I told him I couldn't see him anymore. Needless to say, I'm glad he's back in my life. It took a long time for me to emotionally heal from that relationship and from the abortion. I had always hoped that someday I would have the opportunity to have children with someone who was really in love with me and not abusive. Here it is now, 11 years later, and I am in a loving relationship with a wonderful man. Last year, however, I had to have a hysterectomy due to fibroids. I had never had and now will no longer ever be able to bear children. However, the choice to have an abortion that I made in 2001, I still stand strong with that. That was submitted by an anonymous source. I yield.
Hi, my name is Maddie Mock, and I am a grad school student in public health. And I'm here today because I believe women should have the right to choose their own medical procedures. I'm going to continue reading from the Michigan Journal of Gender and Law. Anti-abortion legislators might argue that the beneficence principle requirement to avoid harm justifies biased counseling laws that are intended to make abortion less likely because they prevent harm to embryos and fetuses. The position is that the embryo or fetus is an appropriate object of beneficence, that is, an entity to which there is a moral obligation to prevent harm. Therefore, actions that prevent harm to the embryo or fetus are justified by the principle of beneficence, even when they violate the principle of respect for autonomy. This position may be grounded on a tenable balance of the two principles, although it is balancing that I believe is incorrect. But the protocols generated by it cannot legitimately be called informed consent. This is because the position justifies controlling an individual's actions in order to protect others. Indeed, the logical extension of the position is to eliminate abortion as a choice for women because abortion harms embryos and fetuses. The position endorses the suspension of autonomy protective features of informed consent practices in order to protect the well-being of embryos and fetuses. It holds that beneficence towards embryos and fetuses requires that women's ability to consent to abortion be less than fully voluntary and enforced. For those who believe that the destruction of an embryo or fetus is a moral wrong that outweighs the moral value of a woman's exercise of self-determination, this may be an attractive policy position, but is not one that enhances informed consent. After Fadden and Beauchamp's book, possibly the next most cited work on informed consent is Informed Consent, Legal Theory and Clinical Practice, a guide to the law and ethics of informed consent for clinicians. In this book, Jessica Berg and her co-authors present a view of informed consent as shared decision-making between healthcare professionals and patients, one based squarely on the values of autonomy and patient well-being. Healthcare professionals should promote the conditions that allow autonomous decisions, which includes avoiding as much as possible pressures of time, pictorial presentations of information and options. Berg and her co-authors contend that autonomous decision-making is the right of patients, not an obligation. Patients should be allowed to delegate informed decision-making to others whom they trust. When it comes to the information that should be disclosed to patients, Berg and her co-authors do not provide a firm ethical position, but rather glean generalizations from tort cases to offer topics that physicians should consider. They note at the outset that too much should be put into context. Physicians should disclose the nature of the procedure, including expected benefits. They should discuss risks, and when deciding whether to disclose a particular risk, they should consider its nature, magnitude, probability, and imminence. Risks that are common, known, remote, or minor need not be disclosed. This means that exaggerated risk statements like those found in some bias counseling laws are not warranted. Patients should be informed about alternatives to the proposed intervention, so that they may make decisions according to their values and goals. Berg and co-authors expressly disapprove of government-adopted lists of required disclosures like those in biased counseling laws, calling them contrary to the spirit of the informed consent doctrine, because they detract from the need for personalized communication. Berg and her co-authors also summarize other legal requirements of informed consent, noting that patients' understanding and voluntariness are required, although they provide little ethical insight into these concepts beyond pointing out that they are important to patient decision-making. They discuss the waiver exception to the legal requirement of informed consent as well, arguing that the doctrine's primary objective to promote individual self-determination means that patients should not be compelled to receive information they do not want or to make decisions they do not wish to make. This means that mandatory descriptions and oscillations of ultrasounds are unethical, as in any irrelevant information that is unwanted, such as detailed descriptions of surgical procedures or pictures of embryos and fetuses. The ethical model of informed consent that Berg and her co-authors prefer is a process model, one that assumes that medical decision-making is not a discrete event. It emphasizes a two-way transfer of information between patient and physician that the authors refer to as mutual monitoring. Physicians must offer information in a way that facilitates patient decision-making. Berg and co-authors warn against greeting patients at the first encounter with a terrifying list of potential diagnoses, including remote and usually fatal possibilities. The patient retains the power to refuse the recommended intervention. Berg and her co-authors find it appropriate for discussions between professional and patient to cover values. They think patients may benefit from the physician's perspective on religious, moral, or emotional issues when the physician has dealt with a certain situation repeatedly. However, the model does not provide support for a law compelling the doctor to be a mouthpiece for the government's ideological views. Berg and her co-authors consider the benefit of value discussions to be based on the patient's desire for input and the doctor's experience with similar situations. Berg and her co-authors express concern about the possible pressure on patients created by receiving information shortly before surgery to which they've already committed. The process model addresses this by recommending keeping patients well informed throughout the treatment process. It may seem that the process model would provide support for a mandatory waiting period of some fixed length. Certainly, the process model is in favor of early discussion of relevant information and giving patients the time they need to decide. However, not every patient needs the same amount of time. The solution of time pressures is to give patients control over the time by letting them go home, and if they decide to proceed, schedule another appointment. Not all ethicists accept autonomy as a theoretical foundation for informed consent. Stephen Ware, a philosopher with experience as an ethical consultant to clinicians, offers an operational account of informed consent. This account seeks to articulate a model of informed consent that responds to practical problems that clinicians face and offers effective guidance. Ware's account is based on beneficence, that it derives from a recognition of the ways that informed consent benefits patients. He expresses skepticism about the new ethos of patient autonomy, which emphasizes patients' interest in freedom from interference and assumes that if only patients would stop paternalizing their patients and provide them with sufficient information, patient autonomy would blossom forth. Ware explains that many clinicians view the version of informed consent resulting from the new ethos to be unattainable and sees dangers in disclosing too much to patients. For example, a version of the placebo effect means that informing patients of risks and complications may make them more likely to occur. Clinicians also may doubt the benefit to the patients of protecting patient autonomy in cases where its exercise leads to the imprudent refusal of treatment and a tragic outcome. On the other hand, autonomy is an important value in our society, and participation in decision-making can have medical benefits for the patient. There is evidence that both patient anxiety and the experience of pain are reduced when patients are well-informed, and that well-informed patients are better satisfied and better able to adapt to new situations. The informed consent process can also improve the physician-patient relationship, alert physicians to useful information about patients, improve patient compliance with treatment regimens, and aid the pursuit of preventative goals. Ware articulates a model of informed consent that can be used as a medical management tool to reap these benefits. Ware's model views informed consent as a structured discussion between physician and patient that takes place in a process of establishing trust and information sharing. It may lead to a longer, more wide-ranging discussion over time. The informed consent event proceeds in 3 stages. First, a comprehensive disclosure broadly informs the patient about her diagnosis, the recommended treatment, and its risks and benefits, and alternative treatment options. The interaction at this stage is designed to alert the clinician to patient hesitance, misconceptions, or desire for more information. Second, the core disclosure focuses on the actual choice the patient must make and requires the physician to explain her recommendation. Third, the patient is asked to give feedback by summarizing her understanding of the disclosures and asking any questions she may have. At the end of this process, the physician formally requests the patient's consent to the recommended treatment. Ware recognizes the traditional exceptions to the physician's obligation to obtain informed consent to treatment: patient incompetence, emergencies, patient waiver, and the therapeutic privilege. Ware's model does not allow the physician to make a recommendation where the choice involves subjective, value-laden judgments. This can come about when there are multiple options available that are equally reasonable from a medical point of view. Ware expressly includes abortion category decisions on which the physician should not make a recommendation, because the values at stake are so profound and personal that only the patient can speak to them. It is an implication of this feature of the model that ideological and moral statements without medical content should not be part of the informed consent event. Physicians should give an accurate rendition of the risk and complication profile of a given intervention. One of the goals of informed consent event is to develop trust between physician and patient, which requires that the physician not lead the patient astray. At the comprehensive disclosure stage, risks should be identified along with their likelihood of occurrence. Major risks with a high magnitude, for example, death or paralysis, and high percentage of occurrence should be emphasized. Risks should be discussed in the context of counterbalancing benefits and a comparison of the risks of other options, including non-treatment. This discussion should be narrowed to major risks at the core disclosure stage. Although Ware recognizes the legitimacy of the principle, when in doubt, mention it at the comprehensive disclosure stage. His model never sanctions making inaccurate statements about risks. It holds that false understanding of the essential facts renders the incorporating decision-making process invalid. Ware requires the percentages of occurrence of risks be mentioned and requires balancing risk disclosures in the context of benefits and the risk profiles of alternatives. Some states' abortion counseling laws fail to satisfy this model. They require physicians to make inaccurate statements about risks, as demonstrated above. They mention risks of abortion without explaining their likelihood and offer one-sided information about risks, focusing on negative risks of abortion without mentioning the benefits of abortion, or in some cases, the risks of childbirth. Counseling materials make warnings about high-magnitude risks like breast cancer and infertility without offering information about the low percentage of occurrence of those risks or the fact that abortion does not increase them. According to Ware's model, detailed actual understanding on the part of the patient is not necessarily a goal of an informed consent. Some patients may benefit from it, others may not. Indeed, Ware thinks that we should be willing to respect the patient's autonomy in the sense that he does not want very much detail and is willing to rely on the physician's judgment. The model accommodates different levels of disclosure in different circumstances. Contrary to the one-size-fits-all mandatory disclosures of many biased counseling laws. Furthermore, Ware's model recognizes the waiver exception, allowing patients to waive the disclosures normally allowed to them, and letting the physician make the decision as to the appropriate intervention. Ware thinks that physicians should not allow patients to use waiver to abdicate personal and profound decisions. But the patient who has made the personal and profound decision to terminate her pregnancy and does not want to be told about the graphic details of the procedure or hear a description of her ultrasound is not attempting a waiver that is problematic in this sense. Rather, she is exercising control over whether she receives information that goes beyond the core disclosures that she needs in order to make a responsible choice about the intervention. Because the solicitation of patient hesitation and confusion is built into this model, it does not support mandatory waiting periods. The physician has a responsibility to address patient apprehension, which may include recommending that the patient take some time to reflect. But Ware's model gives no reasoning to think that requiring all patients to wait a given number of hours between the provision of information and the procedure adds anything to the quality of patients' decision-making or otherwise benefits patients. Ware's model does not expressly emphasize that disclosures be limited to information that is relevant to a patient's circumstance, but the notion that can be inferred from his discussion of the comprehensive disclosure. He lists the types of information that should be disclosed, as the patient's overall medical condition, the specific problem for which treatment is recommended, the treatment recommended with its attendant benefits and risks, any alternative modalities, and the prognosis without treatment. Risks of procedures that are not appropriate to the patient's situation, such as abortion procedures used at later gestational stages, do not appear on this list. In their book, Rethinking Informed Consent in Bioethics, Neil Manson and Neil reject the standard view that informed consent is justified by respect for autonomy. Instead, their account is deontological in that it focuses on rights and obligations. It is centered on the insight that informed consent changes the character of an action from a violation of a norm, right, or obligation into an ethically or legally acceptable action. For example, if A stabs B with a needle, A commits battery and violates B's right to bodily integrity. However, if A stabs B with a needle because A is taking a sample of B's blood with B's consent, then A has not wronged B thereby. Informed consent in medicine is justified not by a need to protect autonomy, but by a need to waive important norms in order for treatment to be possible. Manson and O'Neill describe informed consent as more than mere disclosure, but rather a communicative transaction that is governed and constrained by a rich normative framework, including norms of intelligibility, relevance, accuracy, and honesty. A transaction that satisfies these communicative norms can waive specific rights, such as the right not to be battered. Manson and O'Neill described the standard view regarding informed consent as one that strives to make more explicit and specific because it is conceived as the disclosure of information needed for autonomous decision-making. They argue that this effort has resulted in standards that are overly formalistic, impossible to satisfy in practice. They also question the general agreement that informed consent is required for the sake of autonomy, and that autonomy is a basic ethical value. They are skeptical about this supposed agreement because they diagnose substantial disagreement within the field of medical ethics regarding how to conceive of autonomy, its importance in the field, and its connection to informed consent. Part of the motivation of Manson and O'Neill's account is their view of the deficiencies present in common ways of thinking about the communication of information. The container and the conduit metaphors. Information is commonly thought of as a material that is contained somewhere. It is possessed by people or stored in written text. For example, a related view is that the act of communication is the conveyance or transfer of information through some conduit, such as speech. Manson and O'Neill point out that this way of thinking obscures the crucial importance of context, communicative norms, and background expectations. Among the norms governing communication are epistemic norms concerning knowledge. Speakers who make assertions, that is, statements that represent the world if they are true, have an epistemic responsibility to communicate the way the world actually is. Speakers have a responsibility to their listeners not to do things that are likely to mislead them, including apparently asserting a fact when actually doing something else. A pair of examples of the importance of context to communication will illustrate the point. The actor on stage does not mislead the audience when she shouts, "The building is on fire, Aunt Matilda, everybody leave." But the person who shouts the same thing in a crowded train station is likely to lead people who have mistaken beliefs that will affect their behavior. In addition to the responsibility not to engage in communicative acts that would lead the audience to believe things the speaker does not believe to be true, to the audience not assertions that they are sincerely believe, but for which they do not have sufficient evidence. For this reason, listeners are entitled to engage speakers in a two-way exchange and ask for grounds for their assertions. Thus, statements in abortion counseling materials that are not well supported by scientific evidence, such as claims about an increased risk of breast cancer or likelihood of fetal pain, violate epistemic norms. Another communicative norm is that of relevance to the audience's interests and practical commitment. For example, the assertion that nickel melts at 1,455 degrees Celsius satisfies various communicative norms. It is true, epistemically justified, comprehensible, and so on. But if the speaker utters a statement when called on to give a lifeguard training, or when the listener's house is on fire, the speaker has failed to satisfy the norm of relevance to the audience's interests. Good communicative practice, therefore, always involves withholding information, comprehensible, true, grounded information that could have been conveyed. This norm highlights a problem with the standards views urge for greater specificity in informed consent disclosures. Too much specificity may harm the ethical adequacy of a communicative transaction. It also shows the ethical problem with biased counseling laws that require the description of graphic details of abortion procedures, especially those the patient will not undergo, or descriptions of patients' ultrasounds, because such disclosures are not relevant to patients' interests. Providing them violates the norms of communicative transactions. As I have explained, Manson and O'Neill hold that the ethical justification of informed consent is that it constitutes a waiver of ethical and legal requirements. Their position entails that the scope of informed consent requirements is not determined by the prerequisites for autonomy, but by ethical and legal norms that are at play in a given circumstance. For the same reason, the authors are skeptical of attempts to impose uniform standards on informed consent practices, such as a list of mandated disclosures. They argue that for a routine intervention like taking a blood sample, a patient's rolling up their sleeve and extending her arm is sufficient implied consent, and that an explanation of the procedure from the nurse is not necessary. In diagnosing and providing a treatment, a physician's use of simplified language that omits much be ethically appropriate as long as the physician does not deceive or manipulate the patient, and the subsequent treatment does not force or coerce. In addition, rare and minor risks can ethically be left unmentioned, since there is a limit to how much can be disclosed. Bias counseling laws' long lists of low-frequency risks are therefore not supported by this model. On the other hand, where the treatment is complex or unfamiliar, or comes with high risks or significant side effects, informed consent standards demand greater specificity and explicitness. Most fundamentally, consent is a way of ensuring that those subjected to invasive interventions are not abused, manipulated, or undermined, or wronged in comparably serious ways. What matters will vary depending on the case at hand, and the more is not always better. Nevertheless, the authors acknowledge that any request for consent will include some account of a proposed action or intervention, and of the effects, including risks and benefits, that are thought likely. Manchin and O'Neill hold that the disclosures made in the informed consent process must be intelligible, relevant to patients, and adequately accurate given each party's background knowledge and inferential competencies. The epistemic norms that govern communication also demand that communication is not dishonest, which rules out the use of exaggeration, omission of important qualifications, and mere confusion, as well as communications that are misled or manipulative. Furthermore, patients do not offer genuine consent or refusal when they base consent or refusal on the misunderstandings of proposed interventions. As in the case with other ethical accounts of informed consent, this view condemns misleading statements and those that omit qualifications such as fetal pain statements and statements about psychological consequences of abortion. A key aspect of their view is that Manchin and O'Neill recognize the ability of a patient to make judgments of reliability and trustworthiness about healthcare professionals. This is one of the facts that justifies a patient's decision to not try to learn everything about a given intervention prior to consenting. After all, patients hire professionals precisely because they have the expertise that patients do not, and trusting the recommendation of a professional without insisting on being informed of every detail can be entirely rational. Carefully applying Manchin and O'Neill's account to abortion-specific counseling laws requires examining the norms that would be violated by the termination of pregnancy in the absence of patient consent. Before discussing the laws themselves, it is important to clarify what Manchin and O'Neill's account ethically requires of informed consent to abortion. There is a widespread agreement that the destruction of a wanted pregnancy would be a serious moral wrong, resulting in tort and criminal consequences in many states. These norms protect prospective mothers' interests in the continuation of their pregnancies, and for many people they express the value of pregnancy, whether its metaphysical status is seen as potential life or as a person. Informed consent to abortion, therefore, must be sufficient to ensure that the patient waives these norms. This requires making certain that the patient understands that an abortion is the destruction of a pregnancy and is irreversible, as well as making certain that the patient wants to end her pregnancy. This much would be required by the general applicable informed consent laws that exist in every state. Assuming that the norms surrounding the termination of pregnancy differ depending on the stage of the pregnancy, that is, many would find that the gestational age of the pregnancy is relevant to a moral significance of its destruction. Manchin and O'Neill's account would presumably counsel a disclosure of the gestational age and information about the developmental features of pregnancy. Given their emphasis on relevance in the two-way communication, Manchin and O'Neill would surely require that the provider elicit from the patient that she finds important and answers any of her questions.
My name is Erin, and I'm from Kansas City. I'm participating in the filibuster today because I believe that private medical decisions should be left to a woman with the counsel of her doctor and not politicians. And I will continue to read from the Michigan Journal of Gender and Law. Biased counseling laws go further than the requirements just mentioned, however. They include exaggerated and misleading information about risks of serious outcomes like infertility and psychological problems. Such statements violate communicative norms requiring adequate accuracy in the inclusion of qualifying statements. For example, Michigan requires that patients be told that as a result of an abortion, some women may experience depression, feelings of guilt, sleep disturbance, loss of interest in work or sex or anger. This statement is literally true, but it omits relevant qualifications. Most women who get abortions do not distinct from their abortions. The statement is calculated to mislead patients into thinking the risk is greater than it really is, which makes it a violation of the norms that govern informed consent transactions. Note that the strength of the norms that apply to abortion does nothing to justify misleading statements about risk. Those norms condemn the termination of a wanted pregnancy. Tricking a woman into continuing to carry an unwanted pregnancy, telling her that she will be harmed by the abortion procedure, does not serve norms against the destruction of wanted pregnancies. As we have seen, Manson and O'Neill's maxim that a speaker should make her statements relevant to the listener's interests shows that irrelevant information does not enhance informed consent. For the same reasons, patients should not be forced to hear information that they affirmatively state they do not want to hear. This counsels against mandatory statements to people to listen to a description of ultrasound or the embryonic or fetal heartbeat. Those women who feel that viewing or listening to a description of an ultrasound or listening to heart tones is relevant are free to receive the information. Other women should not have it forced upon about the moral or metaphysical status of the embryo or fetus do not fare and better. A woman who wants this kind of information is able to seek it out, whether from a professional or an authority on such matters. As before, the norms that protect wanted pregnancies from destruction provide no justification for imposing information seeking to terminate her pregnancy. Finally, mandatory waiting periods are not supported by Manson and O'Neill's approach to informed consent. The authors are opposed to uniform, therefore would not favor to wait a standard amount of time, even if some patients ought to be given time to consider their options. He would use the standard autonomous supervision theory propounded by Fake and Buchanan and offer in its place a fair transaction model of consent, on which consent serves the values of both autonomy and well-being. Is whether a consent transaction is morally transformative, and in particular, whether a consent transaction renders it permissible for the person seeking consent to concede. Their model recognizes the bilateral nature of consent transactions and holds that a morally permitted to proceed on the basis of a consent transaction if A has treated B fairly and responds in a reasonable manner to B's token or expression of consent, or what A reasonably believes is B's token or expression of consent. Miller and Wertheimer's model generates different results about morally effective consent than the autonomous authorization model because it holds that valid consent is neither necessary nor sufficient for moral transformation. For example, they describe the following case. A department chair says, "I'm going to appoint C to our new position unless anyone objects." B is daydreaming and says nothing. A assumes that B has authorized him to appoint C. B has not given valid consent because she is not aware of the proposal and does not authorize it, so B would not be permitted to proceed on the autonomous authorization model. However, A is reasonable in believing that B has consented, and it is morally permissible for A to proceed on the fair transaction model. The characteristics that allow to be morally sensitive, information and competence are explained by the fair transaction model. In medicine, where there is a dramatic difference in knowledge between the parties, a concern with fairness requires greater obligation on the more knowledgeable party to volunteer information. On the other hand, if a person seeking consent coerces, deceives, or takes advantage of the incapacity of another, she is not morally permitted to proceed because she has not treated the other fairly. Thus, the model gives that the patient who has been given exaggerated risk statements, like those required by some biased counseling laws, when deciding whether to terminate her pregnancy has been wronged. A patient decision based on a deceptive statement is not morally transformative and therefore does not permit the healthcare professional to proceed. Franklin and Wertheimer contend that the explicitness of consent in the medical context depends on the nature of the treatment at issue. The patient's assumption that the physician has an obligation to promote her interests is also relevant, since we demand less explicit information when considering the recommendation of someone we trust to act in our interests. Furthermore, the authors believe that patients ought to have control over the information they receive. They describe a case in which a doctor tells her patient that she needs surgery for breast cancer and begins to explain the options, but the patient interrupts saying, "I trust you, do whatever you think is best." It is permissible for the doctor to proceed with surgery even though the patient's consent is not fully informed because the doctor has treated the patient fairly by attempting to provide information. To say otherwise would be unfair to the doctor, who has an obligation to treat, as well as to the patient, who wants to be cured but does not want certain information. A patient may have a rational interest in avoiding the expenditure of time, mental energy, psychic stress, and money that it takes to acquire and understand relevant information, especially where she has confidence that the authorized intervention is in her interest. Thus, the mandatory provision of information, including information gleaned from ultrasounds, disrespects the patient's positive autonomy interest in proceeding with the intervention on their terms. On this model, the fact that biased counseling laws require statements to be made to every patient causes ethical problems because it interferes with the patient's control over what kind of interaction meant the health provider to proceed with the intervention. When a legislature attempts to prevent a woman from getting an abortion where she has not been exposed to all the information that lawmakers want her to be, it compromises the facilitative function of consent transactions by disabling her from entering into transactions and relationships that she seeks. Ultimately, whether any given counseling statement is ethical depends on its effect on the fairness of the transaction. The demands of fairness are satisfied by offering information that is relevant to the decision at hand, such as risks and benefits. Irrelevant information and moral statements do not improve the fairness of consent transactions. Of course, such information ought to be available to those patients who seek it out. Ultrasound descriptions should be offered when an ultrasound is performed, but the patient's wishes should control. Finally, a mandatory waiting period does nothing to facilitate a fair transaction. On the contrary, the logistical obstacles that waiting periods present only decrease fairness by constraining patient decision-making. The features of biased counseling laws that deviate from the philosophical accounts of medical ethics are also found in conflict with the ethics positions, statements, and codes of professional associations in medicine. Physicians often consider professional associations to be authorities regarding the ethical obligations that physicians face. This section discusses the ethical pronouncements of two influential professional associations, the American Medical Association and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. One, the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association is the nation's largest professional association of physicians and medical students. It aims to promote the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. The AMA's Code of Medical Ethics establishes the core ethical principles of the medical profession. This code explains that informed consent allows patients to exercise their right of self-decision. The physician's obligation is to present the medical facts accurately to the patient in order to assist patients in making choices. The code exhorts physicians to sensitively and respectfully disclose all relevant medical information and recommends that the quantity and specificity of this information should be tailored to meet the preferences and needs of individual patients. The Code of Medical Ethics appears to reject the therapeutic privilege, stating that withholding medical information from patients without their knowledge or consent is ethically unacceptable. Physicians should avoid conflicts between the obligations to further patient well-being and to respect patient autonomy through truth-telling by proactively learning what patients' preferences are regarding communication of information. Finally, physicians should honor patient requests not to be informed of certain medical information. There is no doubt that the abortion-specific biased counseling statutes discussed fail the AMA's ethical standards, especially since the AMA opposes legislative measures that would impose procedure-specific requirements for informed consent or a waiting period for any legal medical procedure. The requirements that physicians present facts accurately disqualifies deceptive and misleading statements. Making statements that the patient does not want to hear is unethical according to the AMA, and the patient's expressed desire not to be given certain information should be respected. Finally, there is nothing that provides support for forcing patients to be exposed to the results of an ultrasound against their wishes. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists is the leading professional association dedicated to educating physicians who provide health care for women. The ACOG Code of Professional Ethics requires that physicians deal honestly with patients. In its discussion of informed consent, the code states that the physician must present to the patient pertinent medical facts and recommendations consistent with good medical practice. Disclosures should include treatment alternatives, objective risks, benefits, possible complications, and anticipated results of such treatment. ACOG's Ethics Committee has issued an opinion regarding informed consent. It recognizes that the purposes of informed consent are respect for bodily integrity and patient self-determination. The patient's comprehension of her situation and options is necessary, and free consent is an intentional and voluntary choice that authorizes a medical intervention. ACOG envisions informed consent as a dialogue between patient and healthcare provider in support of respect for patient autonomy. The opinion does not list required disclosures. It sets out significant categories for disclosure, which are the nature of the patient's medical condition, the nature and risks of the proposed treatment and alternatives. Physicians determine what should be disclosed within each of these categories by considering a professional practice, the expectations of ordinary patients, and the unique needs of the individual patient. The opinion endorses physicians making recommendations and trying to persuade patients to follow them, as long as physicians avoid deception, manipulation, and coercion. The Ethics Committee also recognizes that patients may waive their right to informed respecting a patient's wish not to receive certain information is itself an action of respect for autonomy, although the Ethics Committee warns that waivers should not be accepted complacently without some concern for the cause of the patient's desire not to participate in the management of her care. With its emphasis on knowledge about and understanding of all the available options, and the professional responsibility to be honest, ACOG disapproves of false and misleading statements to patients. Similarly, the organization's disapproval of manipulation indicates ethical problems with the disclosure of relevant and emotionally charged information like pictures of late-term fetuses. Furthermore, to require women to listen to a verbal description of an ultrasound image or embryonic or fetal heart tones against their wishes violates ACOG's instruction that the patient should join with the physician in deciding the amount of diagnostic information that is appropriate for making intelligent choices. ACOG's recommendation for the content disclosures do not include moral statements, such as those about the moral status of the embryo or fetus. Nothing in ACOG's ethics guidance provides support for mandatory waiting periods. ACOG, like other ethics authorities, maintains patients are able to waive their right to informed consent by refusing material information. The article does not criticize bias counseling laws for forcing patients to receive information that is necessary for informed consent, even when the patients do not want that information. Rather, it argues that information bias counseling laws require patients to receive are not necessarily for and are often harmful to informed consent. However, there is a logical relationship between the two propositions. If patients have a right to refuse the information necessary for informed consent, then they have the right to refuse information that is unnecessary for informed consent. The views of informed consent examined above from philosophers, physicians, medical researchers, hospital ethics, consultants, lawyers, and professional medical associations. They vary in their accounts of the ethical justification of informed consent in the abstract, as well as how it should be executed in real situations. But none of them offers justification for the method some states use to discourage abortion through bias counseling laws. On the contrary, the worst features of these laws are condemned as unethical on every account of informed consent that I am aware of. Their utter failure to be ethically justified according to a diversity of theories shows how far outside the bounds of medical ethics these laws are. In arguing against certain mandatory disclosures, I am not contending that information should be hidden from patients. The professional obligation of informed consent and generally applicable information consent laws require that accurate and material information about risks, benefits, and alternatives be disclosed to all mandatory disclosures do not entail keeping patients in the dark is that the general requirement of informed consent gives patients the power to ask questions which must be answered truthfully and completely. In sum, the goals that bias counseling laws further are already served by generally applicable